When a bank doesn't know where its risk controls are, it doesn't lose a deal. It loses everything built over 30 years. I was eating a sandwich at my desk on a Tuesday morning, looking out at the parking garage across from our building in downtown Cincinnati, when my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder: Final Integration Review, 9 a.m. Thursday. I stared at it for a second, then kept eating. 2 days. After 18 months of preparation, we were 2 days away from the biggest merger in First Heartland Bank's history. I'd been the Director of Risk and Regulatory Affairs at First Heartland for 11 years. Before that, I spent 9 years at the OCC doing examination work. I knew what a clean compliance file looked like. I knew what a dangerous one looked like. And I knew, more than anything, that the difference between those two things was usually one person who cared enough to keep meticulous records when nobody was watching. That person had been me, until my nephew, well, the CEO's nephew, decided I was too expensive. Let me back up. First Heartland had been running merger talks with Helvetica Capital Group, a Swiss investment firm that managed about $4 billion in regional bank assets across the Midwest and Southeast. The deal was valued at somewhere around $340 million. For a mid-size regional bank like ours, operating out of Ohio with branches in Kentucky and Indiana, that number was transformational. It would have tripled our assets under management. It would have taken us from a regional player to something with real national reach. The talks had been going on for over a year when our CEO, a man named Robert Ashby, who'd built the bank from a 2-branch operation in the 90s into what it was, decided to bring in some fresh strategic talent. That was how he described it at the all-hands meeting. Fresh strategic talent. What walked through the door was his nephew. His name was Tanner, 28 years old, MBA from a school I'd never heard of on the West Coast. No banking experience, no regulatory background, no financial services background of any kind. He'd apparently been doing something in tech consulting for 2 years before his uncle decided he was ready to lead the bank's Innovation and Efficiency Division, a title they created specifically for him. I didn't say anything at the time. I'd been around long enough to know that you don't win those fights out loud. Tanner had energy. I'll give him that. In his first 3 weeks, he produced a 40-slide deck full of ideas for modernizing operations. Some of it was genuinely not bad. Automate the teller queue systems, digitize the loan intake process. Reasonable stuff. But on slide 31, there was a chart comparing departmental headcount to peer institutions. And my department was circled in red. He came to my office the following Monday. He knocked twice, which I appreciated, then came in and sat down across from me without being invited to, which I did not. He put a printed copy of the deck on my desk with that page facing up. "I've been looking at the risk function," he said. "We're running 6 people in your group. Comparable institutions our size are running 3, sometimes 4. I looked at the page. Then I looked at him. Comparable institutions our size aren't in the middle of a $340 million cross-border merger with a Basel III governed entity, I said. He smiled, the kind of smile that means the conversation is already over in his head. We are also in final stages, though. The heavy lifting on documentation is done. Once this closes, we're going to need to think leaner. Once this closes, I said, we're going to need more risk oversight, not less. We'll be integrating 2 compliance frameworks across 2 regulatory jurisdictions. He picked up his deck and stood. I hear you. I just want us to be thinking about efficiency. That was in February. By April, he had my budget reduced by 40% and 2 members of my team, including my senior documentation analyst, a woman who'd been with the bank for 16 years and knew our regulatory file better than anyone alive, were walked out with severance packages and a company-branded water bottle. The official communication said positions had been restructured in alignment with our post-merger integration roadmap. I stood in the hallway after the second exit meeting and thought about all the things I wanted to say. Then I went back to my office and kept working. What I did do, quietly over the next 6 weeks, was this. I updated my profile on the Federal Reserve Supervised Institution Contact Registry. I updated my OCC examiner contact list. I marked every active documentation package with my name, my credentials, and a chain of custody log that included timestamps and version histories going back to 2019, and I started taking calls from a recruiter who'd been leaving me voicemails for the better part of a year. The Thursday review meeting was held in the large conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the Ohio River. On a clear day, you could see Kentucky. That morning there was low cloud cover, and the river looked gray and flat. There were 17 people in the room. Our legal team, 3 members of Tanner's efficiency group, the CEO, 2 board members, and the 6-person due diligence team from Helvetica Capital. They'd flown in from Zurich. Their lead was a man named Klaus. I only ever knew him by that name. Who was the kind of attorney that makes other attorneys nervous. Mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, spoke English with the precise diction of someone who had learned it as a third language and took the grammar more seriously than most native speakers. I was there because my sign-off was required on 3 open items in the regulatory disclosure package. The meeting opened smoothly. The legal teams walked through the asset schedules. The capital ratios looked good. The deposit portfolio analysis was clean. Someone brought a tray of pastries and nobody touched them. Then Klaus opened a folder and put on his glasses. "We have reviewed the risk and compliance documentation submitted in the data room," he said. He spoke slowly and without particular emotion. "The materials cover the period from 2022 to the present with reasonable completeness. However, we have identified a gap in the stress testing verification chain." He turned a page. Specifically, the internal model validation reports for 2021 and the Basel-aligned liquidity coverage ratio assessments for Q3 and Q4 of that year carry a signature block that references a compliance authority designation that has since been listed as vacated in your Federal Registry records. The room was quiet. "The designation," Klaus continued, "references a position title and certification number. We cross-reference this with the OCC Examiner Network and the Federal Reserve's Contact Registry." He looked up. "The certification belongs to your former Director of Risk and Regulatory Affairs. According to public registry records, that position was eliminated in April of this year, with no replacement filing submitted." He set down the folder. "Under the terms of our integration agreement, all Basel III model validation documentation must be certified by an active, credentialed compliance authority. There is no active authority on record at First Heartland Bank. The documentation as it stands cannot be verified." Tanner was sitting 3 seats to my left. I watched him from the corner of my eye. He'd gone very still. Klaus wasn't finished. "I want to be direct. Helvetica's legal obligation to our investors requires us to confirm that the institutions we acquire have active, independent risk governance. Without a credentialed officer on record, we cannot make that confirmation. We cannot proceed to closing under current conditions." Robert Ashby, the CEO, Tanner's uncle, the man who had built this bank, was sitting at the head of the table. He turned and looked at his nephew. Not with anger exactly. It was something worse than anger. It was the look of a man doing math he didn't want to do. "Who approved the elimination of that position?" Klaus asked. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was the kind of question that fills a room. Nobody answered for a long moment. I capped my pen and set it on the table. "I think we're done here," I said, and I meant all of it. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I'm not someone who enjoys watching things fall apart. I'd given 11 years to that bank. I'd sat through 3 regulatory examinations and come out clean every time. I'd built the documentation architecture from scratch. That institution was not abstract to me. Real people had their savings there. Real employees showed up every morning. But I also know what happens when you remove the load-bearing wall and tell yourself the structure will hold. The deal didn't collapse immediately. There was a 3-week period where they tried to patch it. They brought in an outside compliance consultant on an emergency basis. He was competent, but he didn't know our systems, didn't know our history, and couldn't certify documents he hadn't personally reviewed. The lawyers went back and forth. Helvetica extended a conditional timeline once, then declined to extend it again. The merger was officially terminated on a Friday afternoon in May. $340 million gone. 18 months of work. The announcement went out as a brief press release. First Heartland Bank and Helvetica Capital Group have mutually agreed to discontinue merger discussions. Both organizations remain committed to their respective strategic priorities. Mutual agreement. Sure. I heard from a former colleague still at the bank that Tanner resigned about 2 weeks after that. His resignation letter apparently cited a desire to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities. Robert Ashby announced his retirement 3 months later, a year ahead of schedule, effective end of fiscal year. HR, to their credit, or maybe their embarrassment, had never formally signed off on eliminating my position without a succession plan. That created what my attorney later described as a fairly interesting employment situation. We reached a settlement. The terms are confidential. It was fair. The recruiter who'd been calling me worked with an executive placement firm that specialized in financial services. I'd taken his first real call in March, while all of this was still unfolding, just to have a conversation. By May, I'd had 3 interviews. By June, I had an offer. I joined Meridian Financial Holdings as their chief risk officer. They're a regional bank group out of Charlotte, about twice First Heartland's size, in the early stages of exploring their own acquisition. Clean books. A board that understands what risk governance actually means. My office has a window, real one, not facing a parking garage. My first week there, the CFO asked me how I'd described my experience at First Heartland. I thought about it for a second. Educational, I said. He laughed, and I didn't, and I think that told him what he needed to know. I've been in this industry long enough to understand something that takes most people a decade to learn. The person who keeps the paperwork in order is invisible until they aren't. Risk officers, compliance directors, safety managers, quality auditors. We are the people nobody notices when things are going right. We are the people everybody wishes they'd listen to when things go wrong. Tanner looked at my team and saw payroll. He saw 6 line items on a budget spreadsheet that could become 4, then maybe 2, and generate a nice chart for his efficiency presentation. He couldn't see what he was cutting because he'd never done the work. He'd never sat in an examination room at 7 in the morning while a federal examiner worked through 5 years of model validation documentation. He'd never had to explain to a board why a single missing signature on a liquidity stress test would require resubmitting an entire compliance cycle. He just saw the cost. What he didn't see was that in our industry, the cost is the protection. The $340 million deal didn't fall apart because of bad assets or a bad market or bad timing. It fell apart because a 28-year-old who'd never worked a day in a regulated institution decided that the people who understood regulation were expendable, and then the most regulated moment in the bank's recent history arrived. A cross-border merger with a Swiss firm operating under Basel III, and there was nobody left who could speak that language. I've thought a lot about whether I should have pushed back harder, whether I should have gone to the board directly, whether I should have made more noise. Honestly, I don't know. I've worked in environments where making noise gets you labeled as difficult and then the label follows you. I chose to do my job thoroughly, document everything, and trust that the work would speak for itself. It did. Just not in the way I originally hoped. My daughter called me the week the merger termination went public. She'd seen the news item online. She asked me how I was doing. Good, I told her. Actually good. She was quiet for a second. You don't sound surprised. I'm not, I said. I'm just sad it had to go that way. She asked me if I was glad I'd been let go. That's a complicated question, and she knew it was when she asked it. Because no, I wasn't glad. I'd wanted that merger to succeed. I'd wanted the bank to succeed. I'd spent 11 years building something real there, and watching it come apart over a budget-cutting decision made by someone with 18 months of work experience and a family connection was genuinely painful. But I also had a better job, and the people who dismantled something they didn't understand were now living with what they'd done. There's no satisfaction in that exactly, but there's a kind of stillness that comes from knowing you did the work right. that you kept the records, that you told the truth when you were asked, that when someone in a conference room in Cincinnati asked a quiet, precise question about documentation, the answer pointed back to you, not as the person who failed, but as the person who used to be there. That's what legacy knowledge is. It's not a resume line. It's not a certification number on a registry. It's the thing that holds up the deal table when everyone else is trying to figure out why the table is wobbling. I keep a copy of the Federal Reserve Contact Registry Acknowledgement from my first week at Meridian in my desk drawer, not to look at, just to know it's there. I've been in this business long enough to know that the work is what stays. Everything else is just a meeting. I've been turning this whole thing over in my head for a while now. Not with bitterness, I'm past that, but with the kind of quiet attention you give something when you want to actually understand it, not just survive it. What happened at First Heartland wasn't unusual. That's the part that still gets me. Tanner didn't do anything that hasn't been done 1,000 times before at 1,000 other companies. He looked at his spreadsheet, saw a number he could reduce, and reduced it. He had no malice. He had no agenda beyond wanting to look effective in front of his uncle. And that, honestly, is what makes it worth thinking about. The damage wasn't done by someone evil. It was done by someone who simply didn't know what he didn't know and had enough authority to act on that ignorance before anyone could stop him. There's a version of this story where I'm the cautionary tale. The guy who didn't fight hard enough, didn't go to the board, didn't make enough noise. Maybe I've sat with that. But I also know that institutions, real ones with real stakes, aren't saved by one person raising their voice in a hallway. They're saved by the work that gets done quietly, over years, in the rooms nobody else wants to be in. I did that work. I kept the records. I maintained the certifications. I made sure that if anyone ever came looking, they would find exactly what they needed, attributed correctly, verified properly. And when Klaus asked his question in that conference room, not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly and precisely, the answer pointed somewhere real. It pointed to me, not as the failure, as the standard that was no longer there. That's the failure, as the standard that was no longer there. That's the thing about integrity in technical work. It doesn't announce itself. You don't get a trophy for filing the right form or keeping a clean documentation chain. You just do it because the alternative is what happened in Cincinnati on a Thursday morning in May. The alternative is 17 people sitting around a table that won't hold. Tanner is out there somewhere, probably pitching his next efficiency deck to someone who'll give him the room to run it. Robert Ashby is retired. The merger is dead. And I'm in Charlotte doing the same work I've always done, at a company that understands why that work exists. My daughter asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about it honestly. I regret that good people at that bank, tellers, loan officers, people who'd been there 20 years, had their futures narrowed because of a decision made on slide 31 of a PowerPoint. That's a real loss, and it wasn't theirs to absorb. But I don't regret doing the job right. I don't regret the documentation. I don't regret updating that registry, or taking the recruiter's call, or walking out of that final meeting with my dignity intact. The work is the thing that stays. You can be removed from a position. You cannot be removed from what you actually built. I keep that Federal Reserve acknowledgement in my desk drawer at Meridian, not to look at, just to know it's there. Some things are worth keeping, not as proof of anything, just as a reminder that the effort was real, the standards were real, and you held to them when it would have been much easier not to. That's enough. For me, that has always been enough.